Welcome to the Career Coffee Chat podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Urban, certified career strategist and executive coach, removing career roadblocks so you can achieve more impact, influence, and income.
Welcome to Career Coffee Chat Live. I'm your host, Aaron Urban. Today, we'll be talking about how to shift your money mindset. Now, if you're like me, most of us have a mindset around money, finances, and how much wealth and happiness we'll actually accept in our lives. Now, I know that sounds a little odd. What do you mean how much wealth and happiness I'll accept in my lives? Well, we do. We sometimes have some beliefs that either fuel and support our success or not. And today we have a wonderful guest joining us who will talk more about money mindset and other financial interesting insights. Now, I am a complete financial idiot. No, that's not fair. I'm not a complete financial idiot, but I know nothing about finances in general other than what columns put the zeros in when I do an Excel spreadsheet. So I'm very excited to have Carl join us. As I mentioned before, most of us have a narrative about money that we aren't even aware of. And this narrative can hold you back from the prosperity that you want to see in your life and career. Now, I may share a little bit later that I used to have a negative narrative about money as well, and it made it difficult for me to embrace wealth. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. So I'm very excited to have Carl in on the show to share what he has from his expertise in advising Fortune 500 corporations and middle market companies, establishing effective FP&A practices, processes, and team. And another little known fact, Carl's training programs, seminars, and workshops have been attended by over 13,000 corporate finance professionals globally. It's great to have Carl on the show. Carl, it's wonderful to have you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your wealth of knowledge and expertise. And also want to say hi to Cornisha and Deanna Kurtz tuning in this morning with us. So Carl, what got you into the type of work that you do, the consulting work that you do? Clearly you're a financial guru, which I am not, but what got you to where you are today?
Well, when I was in school, I decided to spend my time, focus, and energy in the world of finance, accounting, and economics. Mm-hmm. I was never always into finance and economics the way that I am now, but it was just always something that intrigued me. I grew up in a family and an environment where we valued education, and we also valued taking charge of the direction of one's work and of one's life. And it wasn't that money was necessarily the end goal, but it was often a means to have greater control over the direction of your career and over your life. And so I ended up studying the world of finance, economics, accounting, and then started my career in consulting, which was applying my knowledge, my experience, my expertise to companies that needed that assistance as well.
That's great. That's great. So when you work with companies, what is one of the major outcomes you deliver for them? So if you would have to, I know it may be a stretch to just pick one, but what is that big impact?
Sure. A problem that a lot of companies deal with is, companies are large, complex organizations. They're entities that we build to try to execute a certain mission or goal within a market with the products and the services that we have to offer. Mm-hmm. And the challenge in doing that is getting a group of people, maybe a small group of people, it may be thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of people, trying to execute in a universal way to achieve the same kinds of goals. And when you have lots of people who come from different backgrounds with different philosophies, different levels of expertise, you end up having disjointedness. So the goal that I have is to make sure that people are aligned together, that they're speaking the same language, and that they're collectively bringing their shared values to the organization and be able to move it forward effectively.
Right. Well, that makes complete sense. Thank you for sharing that. Because I find that even, between my husband and I, with different backgrounds and different experiences, that we approach finances a little bit differently. He's an engineer, very methodical. He's amazing with math. However, that does not mean he's a finance professional. You might know the difference between that. A lot of people don't. They're like, well, wait, you're great at math, so wouldn't you be great at finances? No.
Right. Right.
No, not necessarily, because it requires a little bit more of the global perspective. Understanding the planning part of it
Mm-hmm.
requires a different skill set. And can you share with us a little bit why planning is financial planning is a little bit different than just being great at math?
Mm-hmm. So in my line of work, I work mostly with companies. And so when people hear the term financial planning, they say, oh, well, you're a wealth manager. Well, I
Yeah.
do it more so from the perspective of a company. But
Mhm.
whether you're speaking about a corporation or an individual or a family, which is
Mhm.
also an entity of people coming together, planning is really taking a look at the future vision that you have,
Mhm.
that you believe may be attainable or may not be, and identifying the path to get there. It's very different. If I can give you an example with retirement planning, if you have an objective of retiring with set amount of wealth by the time you're 65 years old, and right now you're 25 or 30 or 35 or 55,
Mhm.
you have decades to be planning, to be acting in order to get you to that level of income by that target age. And you
Mhm.
can't just continue to say, well, I'm going to take one day at a time or 1 week at a time. You can take one day and 1 week at a time, but within the greater context of your
Mhm.
larger plan. And by thinking about your life and your career and your investing and your earning power in a long-term framework, it allows you to break that down into small pieces rather
Mm.
than just say, I'm going to focus on what I can focus on just today or tomorrow or next week.
Right.
They work
Right.
together.
That makes so much sense. I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of people do, by default, tend to live from where I am now to the next week or the next month or maybe the next year. And it sounds like it's very similar to planning one's trajectory and your career in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Finances is a part of that. So instead of starting from where you are now and trying to incrementally inch forward, where do you want to be long term? So I ask clients a very sticky question: the fruition of your life, when you look back over that, like, what do you want to say you've accomplished? And it sounds like it's a similar mindset shift for those people thinking about their finances.
Mm-hmm.
So at the fruition of your life, where do you want to be? What's comfortable for you? And obviously, we can't necessarily do much with a crystal ball and predict, but we can do a fair job of extrapolating. Okay, if I need to have 500,000 or 1 million when I retire, and then how do I need to get there? And
Mm-hmm.
what matters, particularly in your career shift? I just had a client contact me last night late. She sent me an email. She goes, hey, I'm really excited about the position. Now it's a nonprofit. I know that means I'll take a 50% pay cut. I'm like, wait a minute. First of all, we haven't finished our work together, and you might be jumping the gun because you have so much more potential. Don't just jump at the next opportunity just because it's an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
So thinking that long-term game.
Right. And along those same lines, very few people now are taking one job at one income level for the entire duration of their lives. And so if somebody chooses a job that is either more lucrative or perhaps lower paying on the opposite end,
Mm-hmm.
think about how that fits into the greater lineage of your plan. So
Mm-hmm.
if you were to say, well, I'm going to take a few years I want to spend in not-for-profit, but if I spend a few years here, I may at one point become a director where I'm overseeing other people. Maybe I'm not as much of a doer, but I'm a supervisor and I'm getting
Mm-hmm.
paid more. And then
Right.
maybe my ultimate goal is to become a chief operating officer or executive director of that not-for-profit.
Mm-hmm.
I encourage people to take a look, not just in the entire lineage of the path, but
Mm-hmm.
how does that get segmented into the individual chapters of your work in your life?
That's brilliant. Right. Now, I mentioned, of course, obviously, we wanted to chat about money mindset. And I'd have to say this probably shows up a little bit, not only with individuals, but also in corporations. So if you were to say, draw a broad brush across the money mindset that you sometimes run across, what are the most common triggers or roadblocks that you happen to run across? I mean, one of those I think we're talking about right now, which is that tendency not to look at the long-term plan.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that a big obstacle that people have, and it's an epidemic in this country, is people just living in the moment and not thinking about what their longer term goals are, and how their decisions in the moment impact to benefit or to negative consequence that long term plan. So if you say, I want to have a goal of saving $2,000 a month for the next 3 years. Why? Well, because I need that collective amount of money for a down payment on a house, to pay off my school debt, to save for a wedding, to save for a vacation, whatever that might be. And you go to a store and you say, I see a pair of boots that I like. In that moment, you do have to make the decision of saying, okay, I'm going to make an impulsive purchase because I just want something because I want it or because I feel good getting it. But the consequence of doing so is it may put me behind in my goals. Now,
Right. Yeah.
a pair of boots might not have that much of an inhibition, but having that kind of a mindset again and again and again of saying, well, I'm going to buy this, 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 or I'm not going to save, I'm going to put this money in a different place. There is a consequence of making that action or of making that decision. And so always knowing what you're trying to achieve in the long term can trickle down into the daily habits that you have. I do believe that it's more so about mindset than it is about an actual plan and how you see money, how you relate to money, whether you have a healthy relationship with or an unhealthy relationship with it, a logical relationship with it, or an emotional relationship with it. Those are all, chemistries that exist in your mind that you can tweak through a revisitation of how you see money in the world. And you can also get into good habits that can form over weeks, months, and ideally years.
That's fantastic. There was a lot in what you just shared. And I'd like to start off by really focusing on one of the things you just said, which is around whether you have a healthy relationship with money. Like what comes up when you think about wealth? And the reason I bring this up is because, little unbeknownst to me, I actually grew up with this habit of thinking that wealth meant that you were a pompous ass, basically. And what that did was, in my mental neural pathways, I developed this program that said, okay, wealth equals you're a jerk. So if you don't want to be wealthy, avoid wealth, because that means you might be a jerk. That's a problem. And I would love to hear from anybody tuning in now or watching the replay later if that is something that comes up for you. Like, when you think about money, what comes up? Is it an immediate, oh, wealth means that someone's a jerk? Or is it, oh, well, I never have enough? That's also a problem. If you consistently say to yourself, or maybe you have a narrative internally, I never have enough, I never have enough. Same thing with time, by the way. We never have enough, never have enough. If this is what is always playing for you, is that fueling the right actions?
Right. I think that that's a very important element of self-awareness that anyone who's struggling with money or anyone who wants to use money to be able to reach their goals is very important to have. If somebody sees, and there's a colleague of mine who had a similar mindset of that money growing up was a representation of people who are arrogant or pompous or narcissistic, maybe because it was either they encountered somebody who was that way and they saw that as symbolism, or it may even be the contrast of, well, I am this over here and I'm a good person. I am a normal individual, but over here, these are people who are wealthy and they don't act like the way that I do. Where I think those misconceptions and stereotypes can easily be shattered is you can meet people who are extremely wealthy from a monetary point of view, and you would have no idea that they had as much wealth as they did because they look just like you, they drive cars just like you, they don't live an excessive lifestyle the way that some perhaps uber wealthy people may. And it shatters those misconceptions of saying, wait, I thought that people who had wealth were pompous and arrogant and narcissistic. And this person isn't like that at all. They're a very decent human being. And not only that, they're very generous with their time and their attention and their money and their giving. And so I believe that the first layer of unlearning is to say, what are the stereotypes or the misconceptions or impressions that I have? Where did they come from and how can I shatter them? And then I think a second piece is really coming up with a extremely thoughtful definition of what wealth is. I would say if you ask your average person, how would you define wealth? They would say, oh, it's being rich. Well, what is being rich? Well, it's having lots of money. Well, what does having lots of money mean? Right. It's having lots of discretionary income. I can buy a bigger house and a bigger boat and take more luxurious vacations and buy nicer things. Well, that could be one definition of it, but my definition is completely different than all of that. The definition that I have, that I grew up with and that I share with others, is wealth means having a abundance of discretionary time and choice. It has nothing to do with dollars. It has everything to do with how you decide to spend your time and your focus. People who have wealth make the choice of what they want to do for their work. They make the choice of how they want to spend their time. If they have duties around the house, they say, this is not the best use of my time and my attention. I'm going to pay to have somebody else do this. Or within their job, they say, this is not the best use of my time and my talent. I'm going to delegate this to somebody else where it is their talent and it is their desire. So from my perspective, the accumulation of wealth, which can come through dollars, but the accumulation of wealth is having an abundance of choice, an abundance of control over the direction of your life and where you choose to spend your time and your focus.
I love that. I love that definition. Thank you for sharing that, because that is I felt that being more impactful to me. I have been working on shifting my narrative around wealth and abundance. And that's really, whenever I thought about it, okay, well, what does wealth mean? So what does it look like? How does it show up in your life? Mm-hmm. And some people go right to that means I drive a BMW, I have a big house. If that's what you want it to be, then that's fine. Just know that that's not a requirement.
Sure.
But I really love your definition because it gives you the freedom, if you will. It's almost like a wealth equals a certain amount of freedom. Mm-hmm. To live your life in the way that honors your true gifts, strengths, and interests. Mm-hmm. And I love that definition playing into that, because right. I'm not sure how many people recognize that their narrative about wealth or the emotional attachment they have to wealth or the lack thereof drives some behaviors that may not serve them long term. And I have seen it on the career side, the career advancement side of things, where if someone has a feeling of lack, I'm sure you've heard, this lack consciousness or lack-mindedness, they'll take any opportunity, they'll just grasp an opportunity quickly without necessarily doing the reflection, because they don't feel like they have an abundance of that choice. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And identifying within yourself where that scarcity exists and why is very important. It's not just saying, oh, I have this feeling, I have this mindset. That's the first step, is acknowledging that it's there. Right. But the second and third steps thereafter is saying, well, where did this come from? Why did I grow up thinking this? Was it from my parents? Was it from my family? Was it from my colleagues? Was it from what I read? Was it from what I saw? Where did it come from and why did it exist? And then acknowledge whether it is correct, whether it's holding you back, whether it's justified, and to what extent you need to either relearn or learn farther from what's inhibiting you from growth.
Yeah, I like that term, unlearn. Unlearn that narrative that may be holding you back. I'd be interested for anyone tuning in now or later, if you feel like the narrative around finances and wealth or money was helpful, from your childhood, because that's where a lot of these narratives start from. That's where mine started from. That's certainly where mine started from. It's not that we were poor growing up. We just weren't wealthy. That makes sense. We're a typical middle class family. So for whatever reason, we didn't feel wealthy. When looking back on it and looking back at all the freedoms that we had and the abundance that we had, we actually were very well off. But we didn't see ourselves that way. And I think that then grew into a mindset that wasn't helpful for me moving forward in my professional career. So it's just very interesting when you reflect back on what had happened in your life or your childhood. How did that impact, you moving up? It sounds like you had a very good, stable narrative around that, and that then fueled perhaps a career later on to help share that message with everybody else.
Mm-hmm. I had family that valued education very, very highly. The desire to learn more, the desire to learn what's relevant, and to take responsibility for yourself. I also was very fortunate to be surrounded by friends and a community of go-getting people, people who took responsibility for themselves, and whether that was not making excuses or seeing what the world needs, that's all very important. I think that it's one thing to try to teach yourself, but another thing to be surrounded by an environment or exist in an environment where people have similar values and similar mindsets. In the event that you don't, what often happens is you're over here as the outlier, and all these other people have a different mindset, and it becomes almost a peer pressure to conform to their way rather than have great confidence in your own.
That's absolutely right. Now, Jesse shared some information here. He said, hopefully you're comfortable with me sharing this, Jesse, a mindset for a lack of contentment. So there's always missing the need, or one deserves more. He said that maybe Maslow's hierarchy kind of thing, but knowing one's content state can show a mindset of appreciation that we do have wealth of time, resources / money. Thank you for sharing that, Jesse. That's very important, right? And not getting confused. Contentment is complacency. Mm-hmm. I do have some people that like to connect those two, and I feel that that's maybe a misuse of the understanding of the word contentment. Contentment is actually a beautiful thing. It can be very peaceful and really wonderful. And I strive for contentment, that feeling of wholesome, well-being and peace and the freedom to choose. And I feel very fortunate that I am in that place. And it took a lot of unlearning to get here too.
Sure.
So if we are, though, convinced that before I get there, what I find people do is when I get a pay raise, or when I get this job, or when I buy that pair of shoes, or when I get this car, or when I'm in this place, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be content. Then I'll be wealthy. They're always putting it off. What do you say to those people, Carl?
So I had done a TEDx talk a number of years ago where I talked about an untraditional approach to retirement. And through my own experience, I took a retirement. I called it a mini retirement when I was 32. And it was the opportunity to take time off and to do the things that I wanted to do at that moment in time. And even though I called it a retirement, some people said, "You're not retired. How are you retired when you're 32? You don't have that kind of money, do you?" And I said, "No, I don't have the money to ultimately retire." And they said, "Well, what the heck are you doing? Why would you leave your work to do that?" I said, "Well, there are things that I would like to be able to do right now that, being in the work environment that I'm in, I don't have the ability to do that." Now, the things I was doing was building a business, and I was traveling around the world. And admittedly, you can't travel around the world at the same time you're working full time for an employer, although you could do it for yourself. And so what I learned through that experience is you don't have to have that milestone that you reach of having the million or millions of dollars in the bank to ultimately retire and then live out the golden years that you've envisioned. And I said to people, I said, the golden years of your life are right now. The golden years of doing the things that you want to do, maybe not to the fullest extent of everything that you've dreamed up in your mind, that you're waiting for that one opening. But there are certain activities and hobbies and ideas and business concepts that you maybe have been sitting on. And there is no better time to execute that than today.
Right.
You will never, ever have the perfect set of circumstances where your schedule opens up, you're flush full of cash, and you can finally do the things that you want to do. Aaron, as you and I were talking about, before going live here, I've got young kids, and I recognize that my situation will never be perfectly aligned for me to do A, B, C, D, and E until my kids calm down and they go to sleep and everything's all fine and good. I never am going to have that. But recognizing that you've got it pretty good. You've got the bandwidth, you've got the network, you've got some savings, you've got the ability to be able to execute some of this right now. If you have that mindset of saying that the golden years are today, not tomorrow, that can allow you to have comfort in where you are rather than have complacency and wait until this perfect time that arguably is not going to exist.
I like that. Yeah. I came to that realization, I would have to say, quite some time ago. I think it was in my 30s. I had this wake up call. Wait a minute. What am I doing? Why don't I take a long weekend and go skiing in Colorado? I did. One year I didn't take a big vacation like normal people did. I was project manager, so I had increments of time between projects. So I said, okay, I'm taking that time. I'm single. I'm taking that time. I'm going Colorado. And I was very fortunate that things lined up to where I could do that and just simply take off. And at that time, plane trips were cheap, like $130 round trip, Colorado. I know it's gone. So I did this, and it was wonderful. And I realized that I don't have to wait to live my life. And I think a lot of people do. Not everyone. I think that mindset is shifting tremendously, and we're seeing it now with Great Resignation, the Great Reset. Now we're redefining work cultures and what is expected from people at work, and more importantly, what people will put up with as an employee, and so on. So it's very interesting where we're headed in the future of work. However, it is, I think, a huge disservice to your mindset, to your overall health and well-being, to stick your nose to the grindstone and slave away with this dream out there, but you're putting it off for that perfect time. There isn't a perfect time to be happy and to be joyful. You either make that time or you don't. One of the two.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that we can often get ourselves into a real difficult circumstance where we say that now is not good, tomorrow will be better, next week will be better, the next month. And again, adopting a mindset of life chapters where it's not a linear progression of this goes to that, goes to that, goes to that. It's weaving, it's ebb and flow. It's great success followed by great failure, tremendous busyness followed by a whole hiatus and abundance of free time. And recognizing that because of that ebb and flow throughout life, it's never going to be perfect in the way that you may have built up in your head, or that you may seem to think exists through the consumption of what you're seeing in some kind of digital media. It just isn't there. But so much of it is how you see it and how you interpret your circumstances. And it's not necessarily in contrast to anyone else. I wouldn't say, oh, Erin's got it pretty bad, so in contrast to her, I must have it really good. It has nothing to do with anyone else's circumstance. It has everything to do with how you see your own. It's not a competition. It's not a comparison. It's just a rewiring of the way that you think and say, given who I am and where I am in life, even if times are really tough, or even if you're in a really difficult place, it could be so much worse. Sometimes it helps to see how much worse it can be, but it takes a little bit of recalibration and stepping outside of yourself to say, you know what, things are pretty good. Now is as good of a time as ever.
Right. And I love this quote. I don't know if you can see this. This is by one of my friends, Allison Reeves. She puts out these mindset cards, and she's one of these. I have them by my desk, and I love to look at them occasionally, pull one out for the week and contemplate it. And I love this one. Failure doesn't exist because every action and event moves me forward. And it's really having that mindset shift around the actions that you take, or all micro actions towards that greater goal. Which brings me back to something you mentioned earlier, because earlier you delivered this major pack of information. I picked out one piece. I'd like to pick out another piece. We were talking about that plan and that goal and our mindset and how we perceive success, and then the things that derail us and sabotage us. Sometimes are that impulsiveness, that need to, well, let's just say, it's a dopamine rush. We go buy something. It makes us feel good in the moment. But the problem is it's fleeting. So then we have to go buy more stuff. And in America, it is a thing. You mentioned that being an epidemic. And I think that's what you were talking about a little bit, about this impulse buying, which doesn't really help us, long term. And Jesse mentioned turning mistakes into opportunities. Yes. Thank you, Jesse. That's really, really insightful. What do you think about that mindset around getting more stuff being an outgrowth of success? And is that really helping people for their long term?
When people acquire something, I don't have any issue with somebody saying, I want what I want because I want it. I just, it makes me feel good. There's nothing wrong with that at all, so long as it doesn't interfere with other goals that have been compromised as a result of this decision. So if I were to go out and again, buy myself a nice pair of boots, I've got a pair of boots upstairs that have really been one of the best purchases I've made in 2020, or a $200 pair of boots. Is buying a $200 pair of boots having me compromise anything else in my life? The answer is no. However, there may be other kinds of decisions that I make from a monetary point of view where I say, this is a $25,000 decision. That gives me a little bit of pause, because making the decision to go in that direction means that I can't spend that $25,000 somewhere else.
Right.
As it relates to a car, that might be a $35,000 decision. As it relates to a house, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars. As it relates to an education, that may be comparable. And so when you get to certain levels, you start to recognize that there is a trade-off between this decision and that long-term goal. But where people get themselves in trouble, and I'm not just going to say people, I say all of us, is the accumulation of micro decisions that ultimately become a much larger nut in the grand scheme of the plan. So if every couple of weeks I say, well, I'm going to spend here, I'm going to spend there, I'm going to spend here, I'm going to spend there, I'm going to spend here, I'm going to spend there, every micro decision seems very, very small. But when you add them all up, you realize how much money, how much time, how much distraction they've actually added up to. When I came back from my retirement, or from my traipsing globally during that mini retirement, something that was so striking to me, it was almost a punch in the face, was I would go on the train, I would go on the bus, and I would be the only person not looking at my phone. And I just noticed that everyone around, like, you could have, George Clooney step onto the front of the bus and nobody would even notice that he was there. And he could kiss somebody and nobody would have noticed that even happened. But over the years, I've noticed myself getting back into that kind of routine where I say, I'm standing in line, I'm just going to look at my phone. Instead of daydreaming, I'm looking at the news for the 7th time of the day. And you say, you know what, it's 30 seconds, who cares? But when you look at what that aggregate is in a day, it adds up. When you look at what it aggregates in a week, it adds up even more. In a month, more. In a year, if you were to take a look at how much time your average person, ourselves included, spends in money, or spends on the phone, or spends in front of the TV, and you say, wow, I spent a full 1 month of my time, micro segments all added together, a whole 1 month of the year doing these things, Is that where you want to spend your time, your attention,
Right.
your energy, and your focus? In terms of your money, if you add it all up and you say, oh, wow, at the time it didn't feel like much, but in the span of the year, that was $25,000. I would have rather spent $25,000 over here instead of over there. So these small experiences, while in the moment seem so minor, when they add up, they become a much larger life choice. And it's up to us to evaluate that and decide if that's where we want to spend our energy.
That's very important. Yeah, those micro actions matter, and we do this in many different ways too, not just money, but we do it like you mentioned the social media. That's a great example. Like if you really want to decrease, your social media consumption, or you really want to decrease your outlay, having a bigger perspective, taking that pause just for a moment, going, okay, this is habitual for me. Do I really need to do this? Do I really need this shirt because it was nice? By the way, this is not a new shirt. This is an old shirt, but it's really nice, isn't it? I'm shopping in my own closet. That is very important. I think more people need to do that. Go shopping in your own closet instead of on Amazon or wherever you go shopping these days. I don't know. But you're right. I mean, I feel that we don't necessarily connect all these little actions to what they add up to be. And I think subscriptions are a great way to exemplify this financially. How many people are like, oh, it's just $30 or $40 a month? Well, guess what? That adds up.
Mm-hmm.
In 2020, I had my busiest year. I had my most financially lucrative year, and also had my most expensive year because of all these expenses that were incremental. And they add up, and you're like, oh my gosh, I really spent this much and expensive, So then you start looking at it from a very different perspective. So when people want to say, hey, just subscribe, they're keying into that instant gratification, it's just a little bit right now, because typically in America, I don't know if most of us really do think of it. Some people do. They're like, okay, how much is that up? They get on their calculator. But a lot of people don't. Right? Now, Fabian mentioned, he says, is a necessity buy. It's a necessity buy question or a wish. It's a calibration process between emotions and what each of us value. What is important to me may not be to others. It's about our values. So right, you're right, Fabian. It's very personal. So earlier on, when we first started the show, you mentioned, is money emotional for you? And I have to say it is for most people, because it's such a part of our psyche. As a part of our culture, as a part of who we are. So I have to say, it's very subjective. Is what success is for you. It's very subjective. And also, what is a requirement for your life? What you feel is a requirement is very subjective.
It is. What Fabian says, there's one word that he shared that I think is extremely important, and that's values. You need to know what your values are. You need to know what your values within the context of the values of your family, what that is, and how that aligns with and how that contrasts with your community, with your city, with your state, with your country, and with the human race. And what's astounding, and I recommend everybody go do world travel and see how our culture, I'm not just saying ours in the United States, I'm saying wherever you happen to live, how the culture that you're a part of compares, aligns with, and contrasts to other cultures, and why. It's really striking to get familiar with the human condition, how much is similar elsewhere and how much is different. But if we know what is important to us and revisit that again and again, then you can calibrate your actions and your life around those values. Where people can get themselves in a lot of trouble is if A, they don't know what their values are, or B, the values that they've adopted just happen to be the values of people around them. And they've adopted them by default because that's just what they see and what they experience. So it's important to really define what those values are and to live your life in tune with those values. And again, there's nothing wrong with spending money. There's nothing wrong with buying something you like or buying something that you want. But the values allow you to say, well, I have longer term goals, and making these decisions compromise that. If they don't, fine, you're okay. But then at the same time, if you say, well, I'm going to buy this just because it makes me feel good, well, that's okay once in a while. But if it becomes habitual and chronic of acquiring more and more stuff because it just makes you feel good, well, why is that making you feel good? Is it just an instantaneous rush of dopamine or adrenaline or something else? Can you get that potentially from somewhere else that is not costing you a depletion of your bank account?
Yes, very good points. Very good points. Yeah, I feel that you mentioned something, values that are either almost adopted from someone else because we're not familiar with our own values. And I think up to a certain age or a certain stage in our life, we do carry other people's values, and then we start to evolve our own as we experience life. But some people don't realize that they can do that. And they don't realize that they're not just a product of their upbringing. You can create your own way in this world, and your own structure and your own meaning, and then by that methods. So, Carl, is there any other words of wisdom that you'd have to share with folks? Because this has been very inspirational, very illuminating, and inspiring conversation. And I really appreciate the wisdom that you shared with us from the financial perspective, and just making that almost like this beautiful little complete unit of life. Really, I mean, it's a part of our life. It's a part of our culture. Is there anything else you would have to share with us before we wrap up the show?
I would just reiterate some of the points that I had made, is that money does not equate to wealth. Money is fuel for wealth. And wealth does not necessarily mean riches. Again, when I had retired at 32, it was my own definition of what retirement was. And when people said, you're retired, that must mean you're rich and you've got millions of dollars in the bank. And how did you do that? I said, no, my definition of retirement is different than yours. My definition of wealth is different than yours. And there was one conversation I remember exactly where I was. I was in Bariloche in Argentina, which is about in the middle western part of the country. And I was on Skype with my aunt, and she said, I can't believe that you're doing what you are. I mean, you're the envy of pretty much anybody. And I said, well, I don't know about that. And she said, well, no, you are. And listen to what I'm going to say, or listen to my question. She said, if you were to win the lottery, would you do anything different than what you're doing right now? And I said, no, there's nothing that I would do different than what I'm doing right now. And that's often this big question that people ask themselves or ask other people of, Aaron, what would you do if you won the lottery? And Aaron might say, well, I would, take a trip to, Argentina, or, maybe I'd buy a car, or maybe I'd do this or that. But at that moment in time, she said, what would you do if you had this massive abundance of wealth? And I said, I would do nothing different than I'm doing right now. And that's not necessarily a testament to my mindset, but it's the testament to say the choices that you make are yours to make now and in the coming weeks and months. You can't pull the trigger on everything and say, well, I'm just going to go jump off and take the risk right now. I'm going to leap without any kind of reserve. But to be in a place where you can say, I'm doing the things that I want to do, and if I had thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars more, I'm really doing the things that I would like to do. And maybe for those decisions that I would like to make right now, but I can't make right now, I could make them next year. And I'm going to write them down, and I'm going to revisit them next year, because now it just happens not to be the right time. And it's not the right time because of where my kids are, or where my wife is in her job, or where my parents are. But nothing will ever be perfect. And one last point that I would make is this is perhaps a little bit more of a somber note, maybe an emotional one. But when I took that retirement, I was down in a different part of Argentina when this happened. But my grandmother was very ill around the time that I had intended to take this retirement. And I remember having a conversation with my mother, and I said, look, I know that grandma's ill, but this is what I've been wanting to do for a long time. She's like, don't hold back on your life and doing the things you want to do. You go do it. And I happened to be in the southern tip of Argentina, and I got an email from my mother, and my grandmother had passed away. And she said, don't come home. She said, I know that you might want to. And in all transparency, I wouldn't have even been logistically able to get home. It would have taken 4 days.
That's pretty far down there.
But that reality of, somebody's sick, don't live your life because of their circumstance, or there's something else going on, don't do the things you want to do because of this externality. Life moves on. You do what you need to do. You do what you want to do, and you find out some other way to address that externality. What my mother said, and I'll probably always remember this, she says, don't come back, but find a beautiful place and say a prayer. And that's what I did. It was a giant full moon over the eastern coast of Argentina. Actually, no, it was the southeastern coast of Argentina. And there was a full moon glistening over the water. And I made my peace there. But I lived my life because I recognized that I was in the position of wealth. The position of wealth is to be able to make the decisions that you want to make without any kind of inhibition from money, from other external forces. And that is, I think, an aspiration that most of us should have.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I would have to say that maybe that was a beautiful testament to her life and what she gave to you, so you could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I kind of want to cry. It really was awesome.
It's nothing to be sad about. It's something to celebrate.
No, I mean, it's a happy cry, right? It's like, oh, that's so awesome, because everything you share with us is really hit deeply with me. And I hope for all of you tuning in either now or later that it resonates very deeply with you as well. I really appreciate your time, Carl. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show today. Mm-hmm. And by all means, reach out to Carl, check him out on LinkedIn. Of course, he has his own website, his own company as well. And while he primarily focuses on helping businesses, I mean, if my business was big enough, I would have you in and help me out, Carl.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. It's been fun chatting with you.
Absolutely. And for all of you tuning either now or later, my biggest wish for you, my friends, is to keep elevating. Until next time.
Thank you for tuning in on the Career Coffee Chat podcast. It's been a pleasure. Feel free to reach out to me. My email is coacheurban@gmail.com or tweet at coacheurban, Instagram, coach.eurban, or reach out to my Facebook group, Elevate Your Career. So I'd love to learn more about you, hear your insights, and what questions you have. You can find out more about me at coacheurban.com. And don't forget, please do reach out on LinkedIn. You can find me at Aaron Urban. Until next time, cheers. Here's to caffeinating your career.